This is Unit 1, Lesson 10. We have some learning targets here. We are going to solve quadratic equation using completeness square. We're going to derive the quadratic formula, and then we're going to review using factoring and the quadratic formula. So let's look here at how to solve quadratic equations using completeness square. So it has to be in this form again of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So then if a is not equal to 1, we're going to divide every term there by a. Step 2, we're going to move the c term over on the right-hand side of the equation. Step 3, we're going to complete the square by adding b divided by 2 to both sides of the equation. And then we're going to write it as a perfect squared, ax plus b over 2, x plus b over 2. And then we're going to take the square root and solve for x. All right, so we're going to try our first completeness square problem here. So first step there says if a is not equal to 1, then we're supposed to divide every single term in there by a. But our a value there is 1, so we can skip the first step and go to the second step. The second step says to move c to other side with a 0. So to move c on the other side there, we'd have to subtract 13. So we'd end up there with x squared minus 8x equals negative 13. All right, third step is to complete the square. So basically how you do that is you add b divided by 2 squared to both sides of the equation. So right now we have 8x squared minus 8x, and we're going to add b divided by 2 squared to both sides. So what's our b value? It's negative 8 divided by 2 squared. So then over here on the right-hand side, I have to add negative 8 divided by 2 squared. So in doing so, we end up there with x squared minus 8x. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4, and you square it, you get 16. Negative 13 plus negative 8 divided by 2, there's negative 4 squared is 16. So if we simplify that, on the right-hand side there, we get 3 so far. All right, let's go to step 4. We're supposed to write as a perfect square trinomial. So what does that mean? It means you're going to have like x minus 3 and x minus 3, or x plus 2 and x plus 2, or an x minus 1 and an x minus 1. The same thing is going to be repeated in the two parentheses are going to have repeats. So here you can either think, let's factor this here. You could think about factoring that. So that would be what times what gives you x squared, what times what gives you 16, adds give you negative 8, be a minus 4 and a minus 4, and do it that way. The other thing you could do here is think in terms of that b divided by 2. So perfect square trinomial is supposed to look like this: x plus b over 2 and x plus b over 2. Well, your b over 2 is that negative 8 divided by 2. What is negative 8 divided by 2? It's negative 4. So it's x minus 4 and x minus 4. So either way. So then you end up down here with x minus 4 squared, because there's 2 of them, equals 3. All right, so then our fifth step is to solve using square roots. All right, so we can take our x minus 4 squared equals 3. And what we want to do there is take the square root of both sides. Don't forget the plus and minus because it goes there right away. And so we end up there with x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 3. And then I have to bring over the 4, so I'm going to have to add 4 to both sides. We cannot combine those terms because they're not like terms, so we're just going to have to write it 4 plus or minus the square root of 3. You'll also see it written like this, plus or minus the square root of 3 plus 4. Either one of those works. Most of the time, however, you'll see textbooks writing their answers with the 4 first. Alright, so let's try a second example of completing the square here. This time a is equal to 1, so we can skip step 1. We can go right to step 2. So step 2, we're going to go ahead and move our c term on both sides. So we end up there getting x squared plus 4x equals negative 1. Step 3, we're supposed to go ahead and complete the square on both sides there. So to complete the square there, we have to take our b term divided by 2 and square it and add to both sides. So that's 2 squared, which gives me 4. So really, I'm going x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals negative 1 plus 4. So this value here is being added there and being added there. That's your b divided by 2 squared. And I'll write that out, b divided by 2 squared. Alright, so then coming down here to step 4 here, now we want to write it as a perfect square trinomial. So a perfect square trinomial you can think as x plus whatever b divided by 2 there, which is 2, x plus 4 divided by 2 there is 2. Remember, it can be written like this, x plus b divided by 2 and x plus b divided by 2. That's what I'm doing right now. All right, or you can think about factoring this. What times what gives you 4 and adds to give you 4? That would be 2 and 2. And so then over here, negative 1 plus 4 there gives us 3. All right, I'm going to write it as one term over here, x plus 2 squared equals 3. And then our fifth step here is to go ahead now and solve using square roots. So I've got x plus 2 squared equals 3. And so I'm going to take the square root of both sides here. So when I take the square root of the left-hand side, I get x plus 2. And the right-hand side is plus or minus the square root of 3. I'm going to subtract 2. And so I end up there getting negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 3. And again, or if you want to write it as plus or minus square root of 3 minus 2. Usually, however, you're going to see it as the first. Alright, so in this example here, this time your a value is something other than 1. So our first step there is that we have to take whatever your a value is, if it's not 1, and divide every single term in here by 3. And so we end up here with x squared minus 4x plus 2 equals 0. Step 2, remember, is to move your c value over. So we're going to go ahead now and subtract 2 from both sides. And we end up getting x squared minus 4x equals negative 2. Third step is to go ahead and do the perfect square. So let's find the perfect square here. So let's go ahead and complete the square here. So remember how we do this. We take b divided by 2 and square it, and we're going to add that to both sides. So what is our b value there? It's negative 4. So negative 4 divided by 2 there is negative 2, squared is 4. So coming back up here, we've got x squared minus 4x plus this 4 right here equals negative 2 plus that 4 there. So see how I added 4, that b divided by 2 squared, to both sides. Fourth step here. Now what you want to do is you want to write it as a perfect squared trinomial. So we can just go ahead and say x, and then the value there, b divided by 2 in there. B divided by 2 ends up being negative 2, so it's x minus 2 and x minus 2. Remember, it's always x plus b divided by 2 and x plus b divided by 2. That's how you want to write it out. So our b divided by 2 there was negative 4 divided by 2, which is negative 2, so it's x minus 2 and x minus 2. So what does it equal over there on the right hand side? It is going to equal there negative 2 plus 4 there is 2. So now let's combine it as one term there. We've got x minus 2 squared equals 2. So then step 5 here is to go ahead and take the square root of both sides and solve for x. So we've got x minus 2 squared equals 2. Taking the square root of both sides, we get x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 2. And so I'm going to keep solving this. So I'm going to add 2 to both sides. So I end up there with x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 2, or plus or minus the square root of 2 plus 2. Whichever way you want to write it. So again, we have another problem here, completing the square, where our a value is something other than 1. So let's walk through this one. So we have to get rid of the a term. That's our first step. And so then we end up with x squared minus 5 halves x plus 3 halves equals 0. So notice now we're ending up here with fractions. So it's kind of a tricky one here. But bear with me here. We'll get this. So now we have to go ahead and move our c term over on the other side. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to subtract 3 halves, subtract 3 halves. So I end up there with x squared minus 5 halves x equals negative 3 halves. Step 3 there. Now I'm going to go ahead and find my b divided by 2 squared. So b divided by 2 squared. So my b value there is a negative 5 halves. Another way of dividing by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal, which would be a half. So I'm going to take negative 5 halves there and multiply it by a half and squared. It's the same thing. Dividing by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal of 2 over 1, which is 1/2. So if I do that, I get a negative 5/4 squared, which gives me a 25/16. So my b divided by 2 that I'm going to add to both sides is 25/16. So let's do that. So I've got x squared minus 5 halves x plus the 25/16 that we said we're going to add to both sides, and then negative 3 halves plus a 25/16. Now we're going to write our quadratic there as a perfect square trinomial. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and write as a perfect square trinomial. So let's do that. So it's going to be x plus b over 2. So what's our b over 2? Negative 5/4. So x minus 5/4 and x minus 5/4 equals, over on this side we have a -3/2 plus a 25/16. So we're going to have to get a common denominator there. So common denominator is going to be 16. So I end up there with a -24/16 plus 25/16, which is going to give me a 1/16. The left-hand side I'm going to write as one single term. So step 5 there is to go ahead now and to use square roots and then solve for x. So I'm going to rewrite that x minus 5/4 squared equals 1 over 16. I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. And so now I'm going to end up here with x minus 5/4 equals plus or minus the square root of 1. Square root of the numerator there is 1. Square root of the denominator there is 4. And now I got to keep solving this, so I have to bring over the 5/4. So I'm going to add 5/4 to both sides. So I get x equals 5/4 plus or minus 1/4. Now we're not finished with that. We're going to keep going because we haven't simplified that yet. So x equals 5/4 plus 1/4. So add your numerators, write down your common denominator, simplify that. 2 can go into each of those. 2 goes into 6 there 3 times. 2 goes into 4 there 2 times. And then the other one there, 5/4 minus 1/4. So we get 4/4, which gives us 1. So those are our two solutions, x equals 3/2 and x equals 1. All right, so another one with some fractions involved in this one. So this one here, first step, just start working through your steps. The first step there, a is equal to 1, so we don't have to do the first step. Let's go to step 2. So step 2 is to move your c term over on the other side. So I'm going to move 5/16. So now I get x squared plus x equals 5/16. And then step 3, I'm going to add b divided by 2 squared to both sides. So let's find b divided by 2 squared. So b there is 1 divided by 2. You square both the numerator and the denominator. So now let's add that to both sides. And so now we're on to the fourth step, which is now we have to write it as a perfect square trinomial. So let's do that. In order to do that, remember this is the part where it's x plus b divided by 2 times x plus b divided by 2. So remember this was our b divided by 2. It's 1/2. So it's x plus 1/2 and x plus 1/2. And it's 5/16 plus 1/4. So we're going to have to get a common denominator to simplify this right-hand side here. So I'm going to put together the left-hand side there is x plus 1/2 squared. And then the right-hand side there is 5/16 plus 4/16 gives us 9/16. You add the numerators together and write down the common denominator. So now the fifth step there is to go ahead and take the square root of both sides and then solve for x. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Taking the square root there of the left-hand side there, I get x plus 1/2. The square root of 9 there is 3. The square root of 16 is 4. That's plus or minus. And so now I'm going to have to subtract 1/2. And so then on the left-hand side there, we're left there with x. On the right-hand side there, we have negative 1/2 plus or minus 3/4. So I'm going to pull those two apart so we can find both of them. So we got x equals negative 1/2 plus 3/4. And so I need to get a common denominator. The common denominator is going to be 4. So I have a negative 2/4 plus a 3/4. A negative 2/4 plus 3/4 gives us 1/4. So that's one of our x values. And now let's find the second x value there. The next one there is x equals negative 1/2 minus 3/4. Remember, because up here it says plus or minus. So we did the plus, and now we have to do the minus portion. So again, we need to get a common denominator, which is 4. So we have a negative 2/4 minus 3/4, which gives us a negative 5/4. So those are our two solutions. So the quadratic formula, it doesn't just come out of thin air, it actually comes from using completing the square. So let me show you how that happens. So if I start here with ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, we're going to get it down to x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So our first step in completing the square is to go ahead and divide everything in there by your a term. Alright, so then we end up there with x squared plus b over a times x plus c over a equals 0. Alright, next step is that we're supposed to now move our c term, which is c over a, over on the other side. So I have to subtract c over a. So I end up getting x squared plus b over a times x equals negative c over a. Alright, third step. Now we're supposed to find our b divided by 2 squared. So what's our b? Our b value there is b over a. And so dividing by 2, I'm going to multiply by 1/2 and square it. So I get b over 2a. And if I square that, I get b squared over 4a squared. I have to square the numerator and the denominator there. And so I'm going to have to rewrite it down here because it's not enough room, I don't think. So we've got x squared plus b over a times x plus b squared over 4a squared equals negative c over a plus b squared over 4a squared. You're supposed to add b divided by 2 squared to both sides. Alright, fourth step. Now we're supposed to go ahead and write this as a perfect squared trinomial. So that's x and x. What was our b before we squared it? It was b over 2a, so it becomes plus b over 2a plus b over 2a equals, on this side here, we're going to have to get a common denominator. A common denominator is 4a squared, so I have to multiply this by 4a and multiply by 4a. So over on this side, I'm going to get a negative 4ac plus b squared all over 4a squared. Alright, so now I'm going to write this as one term. And I'm going to switch around this negative 4ac plus b squared. I'm going to switch that around. I'm going to say b squared minus 4ac all over 4a squared. Alright, so now we're supposed to solve this using square roots. So we're going to take the square root of the left-hand side and the right-hand side there. Maybe I'll put 5 there, continue 5 up here. So then we get, on the left-hand side, we get x plus b over 2a equals plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 4a squared. Now, we can actually find, we can't find the square root of the numerator. It's going to stay b squared minus 4ac. But we can find the square root of 4a squared. Square root of 4 is 2, and square root of a squared is a. All right, so now let's bring over b over 2a there on the left-hand side there. So I'm going to subtract it. So I get negative b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So now I can just put it together because now they have a nice common denominator. So there we have it. The quadratic formula was derived there for you using completing the square. So then there's just some review problems in here. One is using the quadratic formula, so I'm going to just do one of these of each. So your a is 3, your b is negative 8, and your c is negative 1. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So that's 64 plus 12 all over 6. 76 all over 6. And 4 goes into that. So I can break this down as the square root of 4 and the square root of 19. Yes, all over 6. Square root of 4, there is 2. So something I want to show here with this one is that we can reduce this down. This is an 8, this is a 2, and this is 6. All three of those numbers need to be divisible by something before you can cross out anything. So in this case, we can do that. So we're going to reduce this down by 2. So 2 goes in here 4, 2 goes in here once, and 2 goes in here 3 times. So it becomes 4 plus or minus the square root of 19 all over 3. But all three of those numbers need to be reducible down by the same number before you can reduce it down. So one more problem here. This one here is just factoring. Solve by factoring, so I'm going to have to use factoring. What times what gives me 2x squared? 2x and x. What times what gives me 5? It has to be a 5 and a 1. And then to get a minus 5 there, I need a plus and a minus. The larger product, since the inner there is a negative 3x, the minus has to go by the larger product, which is right here. That's a minus and this is a plus. I'm going to check my inners and outers here. This is a negative 5x. This is a 2x. And that adds to give me a negative 3x, which is my middle term. So then that's equal to 0. So now I can take 2x minus 5, set it equals 0 and solve, and x plus 1, set it equals 0 and solve. So over here I'm going to add 5, then divide by 2, and I get x equals 5 halves. Over here I'm going to subtract 1, and I get x equals negative 1. So we have solved by factoring, did a review on that. We have reviewed solving using the quadratic formula. You learned a new one here today, and it was solving by using completing the square, and we derived the quadratic formula.